She was 21, and flat broke. Not short a few coins, broke to the bone. The kind of broke where the next meal is a real question and the road behind you is closed. And with $1 silver, the last money she owned, she bought a crumbling mission chapel standing alone at the edge of a fading town in the Arizona Territory, a little adobe church the diocese had abandoned and the county had all but forgotten. The cracked bell tower leaned. The roof over the nave had opened to the sky. The land agent in the county seat told her the parish was dead, the town was emptying, and a young woman alone in a ruined church miles from anywhere would come to grief before the winter. But what nobody knew, not the agent, not the town, not the girl herself, was that beneath the altar stone at the front of that old chapel, sealed away since 1867, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Merced Alvarado had been raised by a church and then cast out by one, which is a particular kind of wound, and she carried it quietly. She was born in 1870 and left, an infant, at the door of a convent orphanage in the New Mexico Territory, and the sisters had raised her, sternly, but not without love, in the cool adobe halls and the daily bells and the long candlelit offices, so that the rhythm of a church was the rhythm of her own blood before she could speak. She had one gift, and the sisters found it early. She could sing, and more than sing, she could hold a room of restless children still with a hymn, could make an old cracked chapel harmonium sound like something holy, could find the true pitch of a thing by ear the way other people found a door in the dark. Music was the one thing that was wholly hers, the one thing the orphanage had not given her out of duty but that had risen up out of her own strange orphaned heart, and she clung to it. But an orphanage is not a home, only a shelter, and shelters have edges. When Merced was 16, the old Mother Superior who had loved her died, and a new one came, harder and more worried about money. And the orphanage was overfull and underfunded, and a girl of 16 who could work was a girl who could be placed. Merced was sent out to service, to keep house for a well-off family in the county seat, a merchant and his wife who wanted a quiet girl raised by nuns to mind their children and play the parlor organ for their guests. For a few years it was bearable, and then the merchant's wife came to imagine, as such women sometimes do, that her husband looked too long at the quiet orphan girl who played so beautifully, and though there was nothing in it, Merced had given no cause, wanted no such thing, the suspicion was enough. She was dismissed without a character, which in those days was a kind of sentence, a girl let go under a cloud, unable to say why, unable to get another place. 21 years old, raised by the church and turned out by the world, with a small carpet bag and $1 silver, and the only two things the orphanage had truly given her: her faith, which had gone thin and uncertain, and her music, which had not. She drifted, the way the cast-out drift, singing for her supper where she could, and it was in a mission town in the Arizona Territory, sitting exhausted on the steps of a cantina, that she heard about the chapel. An old man mending harness told her, not meaning much by it. There was an abandoned mission church out past the edge of Santa Ynez, he said, the old chapel. The first church built in that country a lifetime ago, before the new brick one went up in town, and the padre went away, and the parish scattered. The diocese had let it go, the county held the deed for nothing, $1 would buy it, and the little glebe of ground it stood on, for whatever a body could want with a roofless church miles from town. He shook his head at the waste of it. But Merced Alvarado did not shake her head. She had $1, and a chapel, even a ruined one, even one the church itself had abandoned, as she had been abandoned, was the one building in all the world whose bones she knew, whose silence she understood, whose every proportion had been the architecture of the only childhood she'd had. She walked out to it in the long gold light of a late afternoon, a mile past the last houses of Santa Ynez, and the old chapel rose up out of the desert scrub exactly where the harness mender had said, alone against the mountains, a small mission church of adobe, its walls thick and pale, and rounded by a century of weather. Its bell tower cracked and leaning, but still holding its bell. Its heavy carved doors hanging ajar on a dimness within, and above the nave a great wound in the roof where the vigas had fallen and let in the sky. To the town it was a ruin, an embarrassment, a thing better pulled down. To Merced, standing in the desert quiet with her carpetbag in her hand, it was the first thing since the old Mother Superior died that had felt like it might, if she let it, be home. She went in through the leaning doors, into the cool dim nave with the sky showing through the broken roof, and she walked up the packed earth aisle toward the sanctuary, and there at the front, beneath its fallen wooden canopy, stood the altar, a solid block of dressed stone, pale and patient, that 100 years of hands had touched. And Merced, who had been turned out of every place she had ever been, stood before it in the ruined church, and felt, absurdly, that she had come home to a place she had never been. She stood there a long time as the light moved. The swifts had gotten in through the broken roof and wheeled up in the high shadows, and the desert wind came soft through the open vigas. And somewhere in the leaning tower the old bell shifted a little and gave the ghost of a note. It should have been desolate. A roofless church at the edge of nowhere, bought with the last dollar of a girl with no people, was about as desolate a thing as the territory held. But Merced did not feel desolate. She felt, standing in the ruined nave, the thing she had felt as a small child in the convent chapel at the hour of the evening office, the sense of a great patient presence, indifferent to ruin, that had been here before her and would be here after, and that did not care in the least that she was an orphan and cast out and broke, but only that she had come. She had lost her faith by inches over the hard years, the way you lose a language you no longer speak. But standing in that broken church, she felt it stir in her again. Faint and uncertain. Not as a certainty, but as a question she was suddenly willing to live inside. That perhaps she had not stumbled here by accident. That perhaps, out of all the ruined places in the territory, she had been sent to this one. The county's business was done in the county seat, at a land office run by a dry, impatient man named Harlan Pretty, who could not fathom the girl's request. The old mission was worthless, he told her. The diocese had deconsecrated and abandoned it 25 years back. When the parish moved to the new church in town, the building was adobe. And adobe with a bad roof was a building dissolving in the rain. The town regarded the ruin as a nuisance and would as soon see it gone. There was nothing out there, Pretty said, but a fallen roof and a lot of desert. $1 would make it hers, deed and glebe and all, and his honest advice was to keep the dollar and take the stage back to wherever a girl like her had people. Merced said, quietly, that she had no people, and laid her silver dollar on his desk, the last of it, and signed her name in a fine convent-taught hand, and Harlan Pretty shrugged, and gave her the deed in the certain expectation that the desert would send her back inside a month. The desert did not send her back. Word went out in Santa Ynez, the way it does in a small place, that a girl had bought the old ruined mission, and the town's opinion divided the way towns do. Some thought her simple. Some thought her strange, a young woman alone in an abandoned church, and gave her a wide and wary berth. But there was one who did not, and she was the one who mattered. An ancient woman named Paz Delgado, past 90, nearly blind, who lived with her granddaughter at the edge of town, and who, when she heard that someone had bought the old chapel, asked to be taken out to it. The granddaughter led the old woman up the aisle to where Merced was clearing fallen adobe, and old Paz put out her withered hands and touched the cold altar stone, and began, softly, to weep. She had been baptized in this church, she told Merced, married in it, had buried 2 children from it. She was the last soul left in Santa Ynez old enough to remember when the old mission was the beating heart of the whole valley, and the padre who kept it, and the terrible year it all came apart. And she told Merced, in the old Spanish and the broken English, that she had prayed for 30 years that someone would come and open the old church again before she died, and that she had almost given up on God's answering, and here, at the very last, was the answer. A thin orphan girl with $1 and a fine, singing voice, clearing the fallen roof of the church where Paz Delgado had been made a Christian 90 years before. Merced poured herself into the chapel the way the drowning reach for the surface. She had almost nothing, no money, no tools but what she could borrow, no skill in building. But she had two things that turned out to matter more. She had the deep patience the sisters had beaten into her, the willingness to do a small holy task slowly and well. And she had, once word of the singing orphan spread, the quiet gathering help of the valley's old families, the ones who, like Paz Delgado, remembered the old mission and had grieved its ruin, and who began, a few at a time, to come out and lend a hand. Because a church being rebuilt is a thing that reaches something deep in people, even people who have not prayed in years. An old man who had been an adobero, a maker of adobe, in his youth, came and showed her how to mix the mud and straw and mend the melting walls. A family brought vigas cut from the mountains to span the broken roof. The women came with brooms and whitewash, and Merced, who had been turned out of every place she had ever known, found herself, without ever meaning to, at the center of the first thing the town of Santa Ynez had done together in 30 years. She sang while they worked. That was her part, and it turned out to be the part that held it together, the orphan's voice rising up in the roofless nave. The old hymns the valley had not heard sung in that place in a generation, and old Paz Delgado, sitting in the sun by the door with tears on her face, saying that the church had found its voice again before it had even found its roof. Something happened in Santa Ynez over those weeks that no one had planned and no one could quite explain. The valley had been coming apart for 30 years, quietly, the way places do when their heart stops, the young ones leaving, the old families losing touch, the town forgetting the reasons it had ever been a town at all. And now, gathered around the rebuilding of the old church, it began to remember. Men who had not spoken in years worked side by side on the roof. Women who had let old quarrels harden brought food to the same table. Children who had never seen the inside of the old mission ran shouting through the scaffolding, and old people who had been baptized there came to sit and watch and tell the young ones how it had been. Merced, who had only meant to save herself, watched a whole community save itself around her, and understood dimly that this was what a church had always been for, not the building, but the gathering, not the walls, but the way people became a people again, in the shadow of something larger than themselves. She had come looking for a roof over her own head. She was becoming, without ever intending it, the reason a valley found its way back to itself, and the strangeness of that the most cast-out person in the county should turn out to be the one the whole valley needed, was not lost on her, and she turned it over in her heart on the long walks back to town, and did not know what to make of it except that it felt like being forgiven for something she had never done. She restored the chapel the way the sisters had taught her to pray, slowly, from the ground up, one true thing at a time. The walls came back square and pale. The great roof closed over the nave again, viga by viga, and she came, at last, to the sanctuary, to the altar itself, because the fallen wooden canopy above it had to be cleared, and the altar stone reset true on its base, which the settling of a century had knocked askew. It was old Paz who told her the altar had a secret, not knowing she was telling the truth, thinking it only a story of her girlhood. In the old days, the old woman said, the padres kept the holy things beneath the altar, in the hollow of it, the way it was done in the old country. Merced, clearing the canopy, remembered the words and looked at the great block of stone, and saw what a century of dust had hidden. The altar was not solid. The top slab, the mensa, was a separate stone, laid over a hollow base, and the seam between them had been sealed, not with the old lime mortar of the rest of the church, but with a harder, later plaster, the work of hands in a hurry. She knew, then, the way the sisters' hardest lessons had taught her to know a thing, with a stillness that came before understanding. Someone had sealed the altar. Someone had closed the hollow beneath the holy table, in haste, and left it closed for a very long time. She did not open it that day. She sent the helpers home, and she stayed alone in the finished nave as the desert dark came down, and she lit a candle on the altar, and she knelt before it a long while, not quite praying, the way she had knelt 10,000 times as a child. And then she rose and took a chisel and worked the later plaster from the seam, gently, the way you'd clean a wound, until the great top slab came free. And she and old Paz's grandson, whom she called back to help her lift it, raised the Mensa stone off the altar and set it aside, and looked down into the hollow of the altar that had been sealed since before either of them was born. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and laid on a bed of straw gone to dust, was a heavy iron-strapped box, and a bundle of church vessels swaddled in an altar cloth, and a packet of letters tied with a faded stole, and laid across it all, a single folded page in a fine old ecclesiastical hand, the ink an old brown, the Latin blessing at its head half faded. Merced lifted it into the candlelight with hands that would not quite stay steady, and read. To whoever raises this altar stone, it began, in Spanish, in a priest's careful hand. If you have opened this, then you have come to restore this church, for no other reason would bring a soul to lift the holy table, and so God has answered, in his slow way, the prayer I could not stay to see answered. Sit, and let a dead priest tell you what he hid and why, for I could not tell the living, and the dead must speak through what they leave behind. His name had been Padre Ignacio Ruiz, and he had kept the mission at Santa Ynez for 30 years, and the thing he had to explain went back to the violent close of the 1860s, when the country was raw from war and lawless and hard. The valley in those years had been poor but faithful, and over 3 decades the families of the parish had given coin by hard coin to a fund. The parish's whole treasure, meant for the building of a proper church, for the care of the widows and orphans of a hard country, for the relief of the poor in the killing winters. It was not much by the measure of cities, but it was everything the valley had, given out of poverty, the pooled hope of 100 struggling families, and Padre Ignacio had kept it in trust, as a priest keeps such things, meaning to see it do the good it was given for. And then, in the autumn of 1867, the trouble had come. Not raiders, though there were those in that country too worse than raiders. A territorial official, the letter said, a man with papers and a badge, and a corrupt court behind him, had come to the valley with a claim that the mission's land, and by extension its assets, were forfeit to the territory under some tangle of law the poor faithful families could never hope to fight. It was a swindle, plain and simple, of a kind common in that raw time, a powerful man using a crooked court to strip a poor parish of everything it had. The man had made it clear he would have the parish fund, one way or another, dressed up as law, and Padre Ignacio, who could not fight the court and would not surrender the widow's bread to a thief, had done the only thing a shepherd could do. He had taken the fund, every coin the valley had given in 30 years, and the sacred vessels of the altar, the chalice and paten and monstrance that the thief would surely have taken too, and he had sealed them into the hollow of the altar in the dead of night, and he had let the official search a stripped and empty church and find nothing, and rage, and go away with his crooked papers and no treasure to fill them. I meant to wait him out, the padre wrote. Such men move on, such claims collapse. I believed that in a year, in 2, the danger would pass, and I would raise the stone and the fund would do the good it was given for. But God had other counsel. He had fallen ill that winter, the letter did not dwell on it, and known himself dying, and known that the danger had not yet passed, and faced the bitter thing that if he revealed the hiding place on his deathbed to another priest or to the frightened families, the secret would leak and the waiting thief would strike, and that if he died with it sealed, the fund would be safe but hidden, waiting on a day and a hand he could not foresee. So I have chosen to trust, he wrote, not a person, for I can trust no living person with this in the time I have, but Providence, and the stone, and whoever God sends in the fullness of time to raise this church and this altar again. In this box is the whole treasure of the parish of Santa Ynez, the fund the poor gave for the poor, and the sacred vessels of this altar. It is not mine, and it was never mine. I only kept it. I cannot tell you who lives to claim it, for I do not know how many years will pass before this stone is lifted. But it belongs to this valley, to its poor and its widows and its orphans and its church, and I charge you, whoever you are, as I would charge my own successor, give it back to them. Rebuild the church with it, as it was meant to build a church. Feed the poor with it, as it was meant to feed the poor. Let no thief, and no finder either, turn the pooled hope of 100 poor families to any other use. Do this, and you will have done what I died before I could. Ignacio Ruiz, unworthy priest of this mission, in the winter of his death, 1867. Merced Alvarado knelt on the sanctuary floor with the letter in her hands and the single candle guttering on the raised altar, and she understood, with a clarity that went through her like cold water, exactly what had been placed in her keeping, and exactly why it had waited for her. She unwrapped the vessels, a chalice and paten of old worked silver, and a monstrance, tarnished black but whole, the sacred things of the altar hidden from a thief for a generation. And she opened the iron box, and there in leather sacks gone stiff was the parish fund, coin, 30 years of a poor valley's pooled and hard-won giving, more money than she had ever held, and every cent of it, by the dead padre's own words and her own thin, uncertain faith, belonging not to her, but to the poor of Santa Ynez. She did not feel rich. She had been poor her whole life, and she knew the difference between money and wealth, and this was neither. This was a trust, the heaviest thing anyone had ever handed her, laid in the hollow of a holy table by a dying priest who had trusted God to send someone, and God, or the slow, patient arithmetic of the world, she was no longer sure which, and found she no longer needed to be sure, had sent a cast-out orphan who knew the bones of a church better than she knew anything, and had lifted the stone. She told old Paz Delgado first, because Paz was the last living root of the parish the fund belonged to, and because the old woman had prayed 30 years for the church to open again, and deserved to know that her prayer had been answered past all measure. Merced read her the padre's letter in the old Spanish, and the ancient, nearly blind woman wept and laughed at once, and said that she remembered Padre Ignacio, remembered the year the official came and the church was searched and the padre died soon after, remembered the whole valley grieving that its fund was lost, for they had all believed the thief had gotten it after all, or that it had simply vanished with the dying priest. For 30 years the poor of Santa Ynez had believed their pooled hope was stolen, and it had been here all along, beneath the altar, waiting, and then Merced did the thing the padre had charged her to do, and she did it exactly, because she had been raised by women who taught her that a trust is sacred and a shortcut is a sin. She did not report the fund to Harlan Priddy or the county, for the same reason the padre had not gone to the court. The fund had been hidden from crooked law and would not be surrendered to it now. Nor did she keep a coin of it for herself, though the padre's letter and the law of finders would both have let her, because it was not hers, and she had spent her whole life on the wrong side of people who took what was not theirs, and she would not become one of them. Instead, she went to the one authority the padre would have trusted, the church itself, not the diocese that had abandoned the mission, but higher, to an old bishop in Santa Fe, whose office kept the records of every parish in the territory. She brought him the padre's letter and the recovered vessels, and she laid before him the whole account, and she watched an old churchman weep over sacred vessels his predecessors had mourned as lost to the lawless years, and over the faithfulness of a dead country priest who had died to keep a poor valley's bread from a thief. And she asked of the bishop only this, that the parish fund be used exactly as Padre Ignacio and the poor who gave it had intended, to rebuild the church and to serve the poor of Santa Ynez, and that she be allowed to see it done. It was done. The old mission of Santa Ynez was restored, truly restored, with the fund the padre had died to save, the walls made sound, the roof made whole, the bell tower straightened and its old bell rung again for the first time in 30 years, the sacred vessels returned to the altar they had been hidden beneath. The diocese, shamed a little, and moved a great deal, reconsecrated the old chapel, and reopened the parish, and the valley that had been scattering for a generation gathered itself again around its ancient church the way iron filings gather to a magnet. And the fund did the rest of what it was given for, a fund for the widows and orphans of the valley, administered by the parish, feeding the poor through the killing winters exactly as 100 hard-pressed families had hoped when they gave their coins 30 years before. The thief's name, the official who had tried to swindle the parish, was in the padre's letter, and though the man was long dead, the story of what he had tried and what the padre had done to defeat him went into the parish's memory and its records, so that a corrupt man's crooked scheme was, at the very last, exposed and undone by the truth surfacing from beneath a stone. Merced Alvarado did not grow rich from it, and never wanted to, and would have been ashamed to. But she received the thing she had wanted her whole cast-out life, which was worth more than any fund, a place that was hers, and people who were hers, and a use for the one gift that was truly her own. The reopened parish needed someone to keep the restored chapel and to lead its music, and there was no one in the whole valley half so fit as the orphan girl who had bought the ruin for $1 and raised the altar stone and sung the old hymns back to life in the roofless nave. She became the keeper of the mission of Santa Ynez, and its choir and its harmonium and its bell were hers to tend. And she lived out her long life in the cool adobe rooms beside the church, no longer cast out of anywhere, at last, and permanently home. She taught the valley's children to sing, the orphaned ones especially, and there were always a few of those about the mission, because a woman raised in an orphanage does not forget, and the door of Santa Ynez was never again closed to a child with nowhere to go. Harlan Pretty, the land agent who had told her the desert would send her back inside a month, lived to see the old mission he had sold for $1 become the living heart of a valley again, its bell heard for miles, its restored walls the pride of the county. He came out to a feast day, once an old man, and stood at the back of the crowded, singing church, and heard the orphan girl he'd pitied leading a choir in a church that had been a roofless ruin when he handed her the deed, and had the grace to find her afterward and say that he had been wrong about the church and the valley and her, and that he had never in his life been so glad of it. If you go to Santa Ynez today, and it is still there, a small living town gathered around an old white mission church, where so many of its neighbors have vanished into the desert, the old chapel still stands at the valley's heart, and its bell still rings and its choir still sings, in a tradition of music that runs unbroken back to a cast-out orphan girl with $1 and a true voice. The altar has been reset solid, but they have left the hollow beneath it accessible, behind a small grate, and lit, and in it they keep the iron box, empty now, and a padre's letter in an old brown hand, and beside it a second letter, in a fine convent-taught hand, that Merced Alvarado left for whoever should keep the mission after her. Children are brought to the grate on feast days and told the story of the priest who hid the poor's treasure from a thief and died with the secret, and the orphan the world threw away who lifted the stone and gave it back. And the last line of Merced's own letter, which the children of Santa Ynez learn by heart, says only, "I was cast out, and this church took me in." Keep its door open to the cast out, always, and you will have kept faith with the padre, and with me. There is a kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with blood or law, and everything to do with keeping faith. It waits in the holy hollows of abandoned places, beneath the altar stones of the world. Not for the one who will keep it, but for the one who will give it back, and it seems always to know that the cast out, who have had so much taken from them, are the least likely of all to take what is not theirs. The world had told Merced Alvarado she was worthless the same way it had told that chapel it was ruined, with a dismissal and $1 and a roof open to the rain. It only ever takes one person who will not keep what was never theirs to prove the world's cold arithmetic wrong. Merced Alvarado was 21 years old and flat broke. She had $1 silver to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling mission chapel at the edge of a fading town in the Arizona Territory. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has a place ever taken you in when the world had turned you out? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.